Welcome to PIR Around the House. In this video I'm going to show you how to cut and fit PIR board or insulation board between rafters, like this. The tools you're going to need for this job are firstly a measuring tape for measuring out your board, a pen or a pencil for marking out your board. For cutting the insulation board I like to use an old blunt handsaw like this. There are specific tools you can buy on the market, but in my opinion none are any better than this. A small drywall saw like this is quite handy but not essential. You want some sort of straight edge. I like to use a spirit level because it's what I got available, but a long piece of batten or something like that is handy, and that's just for using that as a guide to mark out your board. And a good solid piece of wood like this for tapping the insulation board into place. Very importantly, you're going to want a mask like this. This one's specific for fine particles with things like asbestos, and for this is perfect. These are very cheap and you can pick these up in Screwfix for about £17 or £18. You may want to wear some eye protection. You're going to need some aluminium tape for taping up the joints later on, and possibly some expanding foam just to fill any small gaps we have prior to putting on the tape. So I'm just going to measure up this gap here. For this particular bit I'm just going to use the full width of the board, which is 1.2 metres, and then I've got to measure the width of the bottom and the width of the top, and I'm pretty sure it's not going to be straight. Just using the measuring tape, measure the bottom and the top. And obviously, because I'm using the full width of the board, which is 1.2 metres, I need to measure up 1.2 metres and then measure the width of the board there, because if the rafters are tapering down, if I measured it from a higher point or a lower point, it might be the wrong width. Okay, perfect. So now let's mark out and cut the board. You'll see on here I've just drawn a straight line which is slightly tapering because the one end is narrower than the other, and I'm just going to cut that using the saw. Now if you want to, you can use like a wooden guide, sit that on there and cut along it with the saw just to give you the nice straight line, but I don't usually find this too much of a problem, so I'm just going to go through it with the saw freehand. Don't forget your mask. So I've got my piece of board. We'll see if it's going to fit into place. Now as you saw then, because it's tapering, I had it the wrong way round. So just be careful about that before you go trimming it down to size and realise it's too narrow all the way. Right, so as it happens, this one seems to be fitting quite nicely. That's not always the case. Sometimes they're too big and you've got to trim them down. Now I think on this one I may well have a tiny little gap down the one side where these rafters are slightly warped. It's biting most of the way down. If we've got any small gaps, we'll fill them later with some foam filler, and obviously any joints between the board will tape up, which I'll show you in a bit. I'm also going to put my mask on because you'll find this is the point where all the bits fall out. And just make sure you tap the top down to the other board, because what you don't want to do is whack it into place. It won't move and then you find you've got a gap between the two boards at the bottom. So as you tap it in, keep tapping down as well and make sure they're firm. That's actually a really nice fit. Now as I said, if it's slightly too loose, you can just diagonally pop a few screws in there, and I'll show you how I would do that now. Not that it's necessary on this piece, but I'll show you the example anyway. So all I do is use a really small screw like that. Just pop it through the board, diagonally there. And with your impact driver, just hold that in place. And you screw in, just gently, just so that screw head goes up beyond the board. You don't want it sticking down. And that'll just hold it nicely into place until we get our second layer of insulation board which goes underneath the rafters. And the reason for that is to stop thermal bridging across the timber, and that is usually a requirement of most projects these days under building regulations. Obviously if the project you're doing doesn't require that, then there's no need. But if you want to see how to do the underboarding of the insulation across these rafters, I'll show you how to do that in another video. You can watch that video by clicking on the link that pops up on the screen now, and I'll also put a link in the description section below. Now if I thought it was loose on the other side, I'd pop one in over there as well. When cutting insulation board up between rafters, obviously if you're in a roof you're going to have some angle at the ridge. Now fitting a piece of insulation board with that angle and butting it up to a piece of board that's already in situ is basically impossible, because this measurement from the bottom of this ridge board to there is smaller than from the top of the ridge board down. So if you cut a piece that big and push it up, you're going to end up with a gap up there in the top. So the way we get around that is by doing this in two pieces. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut a piece, let's say about, I don't know, 15-20 centimetres long with this angle on. We'll fit that into place, then once that's in place, we can just fit a nice rectangle with square edges into the remaining gap. Now in order to get this angle, that's all I do is hold the board up like that, flat along this rafter, and then I hold my saw parallel with the ridge board and mark a line down the side of the board like this. You may or may not be able to see that mark there, but I'm just going to cut that angle all the way through the board and we'll see if that'll fit into place and then make any adjustments as necessary. So there we go, there's my angle, let's see if it fits. Now the angle looks pretty good, but I've got to trim a little bit off this board. As you can see there, by just using the saw as a bit of a sander on the side of it, we managed to fit it into place, so I'll tap that in now. As you can see by the bits and the mess floating around the air here, it's not very pleasant doing it that way. The other way to do it is to offer your board up to the rafter, get your saw and just slide it down the gap. So you can do this. You can wedge it in and you essentially saw down the side, just taking bits of that insulation board off as you go. But both methods are really messy. That's why you've got to wear this mask, because it's not very pleasant stuff. Anyway, let's tap this into place. I just remembered I got a small cable that needs to come down the back of this one, so I'm just going to put a little small gap down the side to allow that through. So you can see there, I've just put a small groove through the insulation for that cable to fall through. Now again, just to make sure this doesn't drop down before I put the other insulation underneath it, I'm just going to use a couple of screws just to be sure. Now I know this seems like a lot of messing around, and you'll see a lot of videos on the internet where it's a nice workshop situation, the boards fall straight in and they fit perfectly. The reality is very different. When you're doing this, some of your boards are perfect, they go straight in. Some are too big, you end up with dust everywhere and then they fit in fine. Some, like that, fit into place fine, but they just ever so slightly loose, and you know, if you knock them while you're working up here, they may just fall down again. So it's worth just putting a few tacks in like that. You could use nails as well, just before you get that other board on, and once we've got that up and the plaster board on, it'll all hold it into place anyway. Now, where you've got insulation board, and you've got your felt or your breathable membrane above, you're required to leave an air gap between the two in most cases. Now this is often stipulated by the building control officer with whatever project you're doing. In my case, we've got a breathable membrane, so I need a 25mm air gap above my insulation board. Now, if it's at risk of lifting upwards, the one way you can stop it doing that is by again either using small tacks or some screws at the right setting on your rafter, and that'll just stop the board going up beyond the required depth. So I'll show you on this piece of board as an example. If I was worried about that, I would just pop the screw there, and I tend to taper them down slightly so your insulation board will push up onto it and give it a bit of grip. I'll put one on this side as well. And now I know when I push that insulation board up, it's going to hit that screw and it won't be able to go any further. So that's one way that you can guarantee that air gap is left between the felt and your insulation board. So the other more common way to leave a ventilation gap, especially if you're required to leave up to 50mm, is to use a length of roofing batten like this, hold it flush with the top of your rafter and screw it into place. Now a roofing batten is perfect if you need 50mm because it's already ripped down to 50mm. Obviously you can rip down any piece of timber to whatever size you require. Then when we take our insulation or PIR board and we push that up to the batten, you can see now you've got this lovely continuous ventilation gap all the way along the length of your rafter. And something else that you may find useful, If your rafters for whatever reason aren't deep enough for the insulation that's been spec'd out by your building control officer, you can rip down a piece of timber, or again use a length of roofing batten like this, and you can screw that to the bottom of your rafters. So you can see when that's in place, by screwing that to the bottom, you can add additional depth to your rafter without having to replace the rafters. This then allows a thicker piece of insulation board to go up in between the rafter. So back to the job in hand. Now we've done this angle there, we've got our piece of insulation board there, we're just left with a nice simple rectangle there to cut out with no funny angles. We'll just measure the width top and bottom again, cut a piece down to size, and we'll slot that into place now. Now you can see there, I've just hit that screw, so I got that bit of resistance where I pushed that screw in. Because I've tapered it down, I can now knock it onto the screw, which will hold it into place, but it'll also stop it going beyond the point I need it to. And just by using this piece of wood over the rafters like that, it stops this piece of wood hitting the insulation board in too far. So you can just do that around the edge, and that'll just sit in as far as you need to. That is now bitten over those two screws either side, so it's nice and secure, it's not going to go any further, and that's perfect. And that's ready for taping up. And if you've got any tiny bits like that that have just slightly splayed, you can always go over them with a Stanley knife and just trim them out like this. There we go, perfect. So just to show you this in more detail, we've got this piece here which we fitted in like that. We then did this top piece here with our nice angle up against the ridge board, leaving one nice piece rectangular in size, nice and easy to cut, and we popped that one in last. Now obviously if you don't have this ridge board with the angle, we can obviously just do one or two pieces right down normal shape. But always remember, where you've got a ridge board or a funny angle at the end, or possibly at both ends, do the angles first and leave yourself 90 degrees in the middle and fill that bit last, because then it'll slot straight up, leaving no voids behind your insulation board. If you look here, we've got an electrical cable needs to come through. Now once you know the exact position that needs to come through the insulation board, you can measure up to that point and across to that point using your measuring tape, apply that position onto the board you just cut out, and we'll use a hole saw to drill the hole now. So using the correct size hole saw, just place that in the position that we want it. Once you've got your position, if your hole saw is not deep enough to go through, we can just finish it off using our drywall saw. Now you just need to do that for all your rafters or joists or whatever it is you're filling as part of your project. Then once that is done, we can go around and fill any small gaps with expanding foam, and I'll show you how to do that now. So when you get your gun grade expanding foam, you'll find on the top that you've got this little cap here. Just break the seal and remove that. Then you need to get yourself an expanding foam gun like this. Now take the gun, and you'll find there's a thread in the top of there, and there's a thread on the top of your expanding foam, and just rotate this clockwise, screwing it in until it's tight, and that will then break the seal of the can and allow you to use the gun to use the foam. Just screw the can into place. When you can no longer go any tighter, it's on tight enough. Now you want to give the can a good shake before you use it. Turn it upside down, and then just release this valve by turning it anti-clockwise in that direction, just a slight bit. Give it a go, and then the further you open it up, the more foam will come out of the gun. Now in my example, I'm going to be filling some very small gaps between insulation, so I only want a very tiny bead. if you're not careful, it'll fly out, and when this stuff expands, it can expand out too much if you apply too much in the first place. Better to put on too little and apply a bit more later. So here's a quick close-up, and I'm just applying this trigger very, very gently, and you can see in a small gap how that just squirts out, so you've got to be very careful. So once you've filled everything with expanded foam, you've left it for an hour or two, it's gone off, we're ready to trim it back now. And we do this simply using the same handsaw we were using to cut the insulation. So if you take, for example, this bit of foam there, it's protruding down from the rafters. Simply get your saw. Now you don't have to use the saw, you can use any blade, like a small jigsaw blade if you need to get into small spaces. But just take your saw, run it across the rafter like that. And that will just take off any surplus back to the rafter, so that when you put your insulation and plasterboard over the top, it's not going to protrude down. Now obviously, if when you're doing insulation or your plasterboard over the top at a later date you find a little bit, well, just take it off then. It's inevitable, you're always going to find the odd bit that you've missed. But for now, just go around as much as you can that you can see with the eye, trim it back, and get it all nice and smooth and flat. So there we go, nice and simple. Just cut the foam away with a saw of your choice, and once that's back, we'll tape up the joints. So this is the tape I'm using. It's aluminium tape, it's sticky backed. This one's 75mm by 50m. You can get it in 100m lengths and you can get it in different widths. Now from my own experience, the wider you go with the tape, the more adhesion you get. If you go for the narrow one, sometimes it doesn't stick as well. So I've gone for the 75mm rather than the 50. So I'll start by here, where we got some joints. And when you take your tape off, it's obviously not sticky, you've got to peel the back off it first. So what I tend to do is measure the length you need first. And this stuff will just tear. So once you've torn your bit to length, take a bit of the paper off the back like that, fold it over. Then obviously line it up centrally so you've got an even amount of tape either side of the joint. And then holding your piece of paper and your sticky tape, work your way along the joint. Like that. Okay, and it's that simple. If you miss a little bit, which I actually did on there, I've just cut that too short, just go over it with another piece of tape. And it doesn't even matter if you go over the rafters with this tape really, but because my joints are in different places, I can't do a continuous line anyway. So there we go, that's the job done. The insulation's cut, it's fitted into place, we've filled any gaps with expanding foam, we've cut it back using a handsaw, and then we've gone over it with the aluminium tape. So if you enjoyed this video, please give me a like, feel free to subscribe and click the bell button for regular notifications. I've been Pice Around the House. Ta-ta, farewell.